and before we made a start, and I think more people will be joining us slowly. So perhaps as we're waiting, I might just ask if everyone who's attending, please, if you can put your microphones on mute during the presentation, but obviously not during the Q&A. We'd be very grateful. And also to let you know that we're recording the session as well. So if that's of a concern, please write in the chat and do let us know. Otherwise, why don't we make a start? Hi, good morning, good afternoon, perhaps good evening to some of our participants as well. My name is Sharon Tao, and I am the Education Director and Team Leader of the Girls Education Challenge. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's launch of our GEC Learning Brief series. I wanted to start
with that in mind. The release of this paper is part of Education Above All and Save the Children's work to ensure that every child has access to.
Sorry, wow, what was I think there might be another webinar going on. If you could put your microphones on mute, we'd be very grateful. Thank you. Okay, well, despite that, I just wanted to start today by noting that today is International Day of Education, and we specifically chose today for the launch so that we could celebrate and bring together a wide group of educationalists such as yourselves who know that education, particularly girls' education, must be highlighted and prioritized in order to speed progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And the UN has very thoughtfully dedicated today to Afghan women and girls in their fight for their right to education, with which we very much support and stand in solidarity. So that being said, I am conscious that some of you might not be familiar with the Girls Education Challenge. So just to give you a brief overview, the GEC is a 12-year, £855 million flagship programme for the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The GEC aims to improve the educational opportunities for over 1.6 million of the world's most marginalised girls. It's the largest global fund for girls' education, comprised of 41 projects across 17 countries in Africa and Asia. And to capitalize on the vast portfolio and all the rich learning coming from it, we, the fund manager, which I'll often be referring to as FM, are collating and analyzing and synthesizing a wealth of project evidence regarding interventions paramount for supporting girls' learning. And this wealth of project evidence is what we're referring to today as implementation evidence, which may not be a common term at the moment, but once you'll see from where it's derived and the value that it brings, you'll hopefully understand why we're highlighting it today and in our learning briefs. So before we get into the GEC learning briefs, I just wanted to take you through all of the different points at which GEC projects generate evidence, both for and from implementing their interventions to support girls' education. So the next slide, please. Great. Now, at the outset, all GEC projects conduct a situational analysis or research to understand why a certain situation is happening. And some projects may start with a broad question like, why are girls dropping out in this particular context? And this research may have helped them identify and dig deeper regarding the many different constraints on why girls are dropping out of school, such as school-related gender-based violence, early marriage, menstruation, teachers' pedagogy, family poverty, amongst many other constraints. And so this initial evidence then is used to inform the design of interventions to address the situation or specific constraints. So, for example, research on how school-related gender-based violence affects girls may have shown that there are no reporting or response mechanisms, or that teachers themselves are perpetrators of violence, which makes girls feel unsafe at school, and that girls are not aware of their rights or the laws that are in place to help protect them from violence. So therefore, interventions can be designed to address some of these constraints. And just to note, you'll see the FM or fund manager who I work with, we provide and support critical fund analysis to GEC projects all throughout this process. So that said, after interventions are designed, they are then implemented, and projects will then monitor the implementation of activities to ensure that interventions are being delivered well. So, for example, a project might be implementing teacher training to reduce corporal punishment, and they may monitor teachers' attendance at the sessions to ensure that they're experiencing the full intervention. Projects will then also aim to assess the effectiveness of the intervention, perhaps in the immediate term through surveys with teachers after each of the sessions to see if they found the content helpful, or they may assess in the medium term to see if teachers' use of corporal punishment has indeed after attending these training sessions. They can certainly do this through discussions with students. And the assessments form the basis of a project's own evaluation of whether their intervention is achieving their intended results. If an intervention isn't achieving its intended results, then a project will certainly try to dig deeper and understand why. So, for example, it could be that the content of the training is not relevant or helpful. Certainly telling teachers don't use corporal punishment, that's not very helpful. But providing teachers with practical strategies to manage their classrooms of 80 to 100 students, that will help to address one of the reasons why teachers use corporal punishment. They don't have alternative classroom management strategies. It could also be that sessions are being held at a time that's really inconvenient for teachers, which is why they might have poor attendance, or that training was delivered in a one-off workshop, which often leads teachers not practicing new skills or simply forgetting content after a few months. So this learning can come in the form of interviews with teachers or through observations from a critical friend like the fund manager, which is what we often do on our technical support and monitoring visits with projects. And it's this learning that projects can use to immediately revise and design the implementation of interventions in order to produce a better result. So, for example, a project might revise the content of training to make it more relevant, to schedule the sessions at a more convenient time or day, to make the training occur every week for a 12-week period in order to allow teachers to practice and embed new skills. And it's this cycle of evidence generation for and from interventions that's what constitutes implementation evidence. It's nuanced, it's detailed, it's immediate evidence on what is and isn't working, and importantly, why and how to improve it. Now, that said, GEC projects also have external evaluations that occur at midline and endline, roughly every 2 years, to assess if interventions have contributed to wider results in girls' learning and transition through education. And the GEC also has an independent evaluator, for which one of our panelists today, Pauline Rose, represents. They also conduct evaluations and primary research to provide rigorous assessments of the degree to which interventions are contributing to results for girls. So, and it should be noted that some of these evaluations also entail process evaluations that aim to determine if interventions have been implemented as intended. And this helps to validate and support those more immediate project MEL. And the overall learning that comes from these evaluations are also very much fed into the revision process. And it's this cycle of evidence generation for and from interventions that have formed the basis of the GEC learning briefs. So there is another point that I wanted to clarify, which is that there is a slight difference between implementation evidence and implementation science, which might be a term that's more familiar and commonly used. Implementation science originated in the health sector and refers to the study of strategies that promote the systematic uptake of successful clinical treatments into routine practice. Implementation evidence provides knowledge around the factors and conditions that make a clinical treatment actually successful. And these factors are often related to design and implementation. So for example, in health, this might entail the types and combinations of drugs to use, their amounts, the way they're administered, and how often. In education, this would entail the types of interventions to use, like teacher training, the content of the interventions, is it relevant and helpful, how the interventions are being implemented, like the scheduling, and how often, one-off versus recurrent training. So implementation evidence goes beyond focusing on what works and instead asks what works for whom and under what circumstances. And the GEC learning briefs provide implementation evidence on a myriad of interventions related to girls' education, as I mentioned before, synthesized from Project MEL, FM's monitoring and support documentation, and mid and endline evaluations. So how did we, just to give you an overview of how we at the FM synthesized and organized this vast amount of implementation evidence, we first selected interventions based on those that were most commonly deployed across the 41 projects to address constraints on girls, and each learning brief focuses on a particular intervention or theme. Within each theme, projects were identified based on whether they were implementing interventions that were intentional and substantive. So, for example, a substantive teacher training on reducing school-related gender-based violence would have been included, as opposed to a light touch activity by which, a short message on SRGB might have been inserted within wider teacher training on another topic. For selected projects, we then reviewed quantitative MEL and evaluation data regarding short-term and intermediate effects, such as girls feeling safe in class, and then longer-term outcomes, such as girls actually learning well. And that came in those external evaluations. We reviewed qualitative MEL, FM, and evaluation data as well regarding the relevance and appropriateness of interventions. And during our analysis, we were then, because there were often multiple projects included, we could then compare and contrast interventions, look at counterfactuals, whilst also being mindful of the very different contexts and cohorts of girls that projects were working in and with. And then as a result of these analyses, the learning briefs present findings on factors that affected intervention design and implementation, what better performing projects did differently, and then also, of course, what didn't work. And overall, I hope that this term implementation evidence is now a bit more clear, and that as we as an education community can see the value that it brings. It goes beyond asking what works and instead asks how is it working and why is it working well or not. It provides nuanced insights on why one intervention may be more effective than another. It addresses the problematic assumption that by simply including a what works intervention, this will immediately or eventually lead to results. I have this reflection or example of a girls' club. It might be identified as an intervention that works, but it can absolutely be poorly designed and implemented and perhaps do harm to girls. I've seen a girls' club where a facilitator threw away a very unhelpful and poorly designed facilitator manual and instead pontificated about abstinence and girls' roles in the home for 40 minutes. This was not a GEC project, but it does give you an example and an idea of how an intervention can be very poorly designed and implemented. So clearly, implementation evidence highlights the importance of design and implementation as a factor that mediates results. And oftentimes this can be overlooked in very high-level analyses and reviews of evidence. It also provides concrete solutions and ideas and guidance for practitioners, everyone from grassroots NGOs, international NGOs, implementing organizations, to ministries of education. So that being said, the GEC Learning Brief series very much aims to provide concrete solutions, ideas, and guidance for practitioners. They elaborate on the factors and conditions that contributed to girls' successful participation, learning, and transition. They also offer an analysis of the value for money proposition of these particular interventions, and they provide recommendations to support strong design and implementation, paying attention to implications for scaling as well. So you'll see that the brief on school-related gender-based violence is already out, and all of the other topics in the Learning Brief series that will be coming out in February, March, and April. So just to summarize, hopefully you've been able to see that the GEC's comparative advantage is that we have a vast amount of implementation evidence from our 41 projects and on interventions that are paramount for girls' learning. And we really hope that you find the GEC Learning Brief series helpful and a contribution to knowledge and contribution in speeding progress on girls' education. So thanks very much. I would now like to turn to our panel to get their reflections on implementation evidence and its importance and relevance to them and their work. On our panel today, we have the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell, who's the UK Minister of State for International Development and Africa. We have Judith Herbertson, who's the head of the Girls Education Department at FCDO. Sally Geer, who is Senior Education Specialist for Gender Equality at the Global Partnership for Education. Pauline Rose, who is Professor of International Education and Director of the Real Centre at the University of Cambridge. And Nawal Saeed, who is the Social Development Advisor for CARE International, who implements 2 GEC projects in Somalia. We also had scheduled the Right Honourable Minister for Education of Sierra Leone, David Senge. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today, but he does wish us a successful event and is grateful for the recognition of work that the GEC and FCDO are doing in Sierra Leone. So first, I'd like to start with a pre-recorded message from Minister Mitchell and his reflections on the evidence generated by the GEC.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I can't join you in person, but it is an honor to mark the International Day of Education with you. I set up the Girls' Education Challenge Fund when I last led the UK's work on development, some 10 years ago. Now I am back in the role. I am delighted to see the fantastic impact of the programme. It has reached more than 1.6 million marginalised girls, giving them the education they otherwise would have missed. A lot to be proud of and testament to a great deal of hard work. From those implementing the GEC programme, from our friends in the Global Partnership for Education, CARE International and the University of Cambridge. Not to mention governments like Sierra Leone, who have supported and spearheaded these efforts. Thank you. Last month in Somalia, I saw how the Girls' Education Challenge Fund has transformed young lives, supported by the UK. I met girls and their families who had been forced to flee conflict and drought. And I was so moved both by the girls' desire to continue their studies and their teachers' dedication to helping them under very difficult circumstances. We know that education, especially for girls, holds the key to addressing so many challenges, supporting better health, empowering communities to prepare for disasters and recover faster, and reducing poverty. But there are too many children around the world who lack these opportunities. We're aware just how many barriers they face. Lack of money, lack of safe and accessible schools, the twin threats of conflict and climate change, and the challenges of disability and gender inequality. The list goes on. For those who do make it to school, their education often falls short of what they need. We face the real risk of a lost generation, and we cannot let that happen. This is why the UK is driving a global coalition on better learning outcomes, with a focus on strong foundations, reading, basic maths, and social skills. This is how we open doors to higher levels of education. 12 years of quality education for all. We know how vitally important it is to draw on the best evidence to reach more girls. And the GEC is playing an important role here. You will hear today how it has pulled together the best evidence from 10 years of brilliant work, setting out best practice on everything from addressing sexual and gender-based violence to running girls' clubs and community-based education, all of which have made a positive difference to the lives of women and girls they've supported. I'm sure you will find these new learning briefs interesting and enlightening, and I hope the conversation today inspires you as we continue our vital work, pushing for change, reaching the children who need help most, and transforming lives around the world. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'd like to thank Minister Mitchell for his very thoughtful comments and reflections and highlighting our Learning Brief series. Thank you for that. And now I'd like to turn to our esteemed panel for their reflections. I would like to start with Nawal Saeed from CARE, who is at the forefront of generating implementation evidence for girls' education with their GEC projects. So Nawal, please, I'd like to invite you to provide us with your reflections on how you generate implementation evidence on your projects in Somalia.
Thank you, Sharon. So as you know, Somalia is a rapidly changing and complex context. So in order for our projects, our GCE projects, to achieve success and build long-term resilience, it is actually very necessary for us to generate evidence that we need to understand the response patterns in the different locations that we work with, and also among the population subgroups that we work with in the GEC projects. We have the pastoralist girls, the marginalized groups, the girls living with disability. So therefore, project evidence is actually generated systematically through the fidelity of implementation. The FOI is an integral component of program monitoring and informs program adaptations on a continuous basis. Basically, the FOI measures 3 key elements, which is, first of all, the exposure to intervention, the quality of implementation and activities, and also the adherence to the project intervention. So in terms of the exposure, for example, in terms of improving learning outcomes for marginalized girls, we need to make sure that we understand, are we conducting our teachers trainings at the right time, so that we provide the teachers enough and sufficient time for exposure. What is the quality of the trainings that we are administering? So the right dosage of the trainings when it comes to the content of our teacher trainings. Is the teacher training content designed to improve teacher skills so that it can replicate into more teaching and learning gender-sensitive classroom practices? And adherence to the project interventions. So what is the uptake of the interventions that we are implementing? So we reflect on the performance of the teachers, their capacity, and on the trained teachers, and then we reflect on this and identify the struggling areas and provide recommendations. So the FOI data is actually collected at school and community level, and it's not just a part of project monitoring, but it's also part of project implementation. And what it does is it assists the project officers and the project beneficiaries to come up with actionable activities to address the identified gaps. The data is collected actually using very simple checklists, and the FOI processes and tools are designed to bring together project monitoring and programming such that it has the ability to inform intervention and mitigation on a continuous basis. The fidelity of implementation allows adaptive management processes, and it starts from the field level, taken up to the regional, up to the zonal level. So learning continues with our implementation. So in conclusion, our projects are systematically tracking performance through the fidelity of implementation, and this is done at 2 levels. And the first question we ask ourselves is, are activities being implemented as designed? And are these activities having the expected results? And for whom? If not, why? And how do we mitigate and adjust our interventions to reach the expected results? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It was that's a perfect example through your explanation of the FOI, the fidelity of implementation tool that you use, for exactly what you were saying. You know, is the training happening at the right time? Is that content relevant and helpful? And is that performance of teachers, you know, changing as a result? And so the fact that you're training that or tracking that and then adapting so readily and immediately as a result is extremely valuable. So thank you for elaborating on that. I'd like now to invite Pauline to provide reflections on, you generate a lot of evidence, a lot of rigorous and thoughtful evidence as well, perhaps at a different level, and how can implementation evidence perhaps complement these other forms of evidence? Would love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon. Anna, also happy International Day of Education. I'm not sure I've got the words the right way around, but great to be part of this panel. I think sort of, to me, implementation evidence is exactly what we should be doing in education. I'm not sure I can separate it out from other forms of evidence that we should be actually doing. And that's me as an academic sitting here. Probably some people might think I'm a failed academic. I'm not doing the ivory tower, blue sky thinking perhaps, but really thinking, what is the evidence we need to inform and to improve policy and practice? And how do you best do that? And you best do that by researchers, and I would include within this sort of the independent research that can provide the integrity from an outside perspective, looking in at the programs, identifying, like we've been saying, sort of what works, how it works, why it works, but alongside implementers. I mean, if us as academics are sitting here trying to work out what the questions are, we're probably going to get the wrong questions. We're not going to be getting the useful questions, the questions that need asking and need answers to. So I think it's very much about that interaction and engagement. And I think one thing I should say, sort of the Girls' Education Challenge is probably the largest programme that I know in the sort of international development sphere, at least, who's been providing evidence at this scale sustainably over a 10-year period. So congratulations to colleagues in FCDO, to the current minister who was a previous minister, Secretary of State, who's really been championing this, as Judith, you put in the chat there, because, you know, we just don't, we don't usually have this sustained evidence. We might have a lot of evidence on girls' education, but actually sustaining that has been so important, and learning from that as we're going along in the way that you were showing, Sharon. And I think this is where, you know, from the point of view of the independent evaluator that I'm now part of, led by Tetra Tech, that's what has been for us so important and exciting. So the first round of the independent evaluation started out as perhaps being a more standard evaluation of what works. There were reasons for that. But having said that, while it was more standard, it actually also pushed the boundaries for those of us working in education of measuring learning, including sort of really that as the forefront. And we might be surprised that that wasn't necessarily taken as given in a lot of the previous work that had been going on. So, but this round of the international independent evaluation, and again, I think sort of thanks to FCDO for championing this and pushing this on the agenda, has been more about very much in the line with what you're saying, Sharon, the implementation evidence. It's not just what works, but how it works. It includes that sort of process evaluation. It includes the more qualitative understanding. And so we've been doing studies, for example, on disability, led by Professor Nidhi Singhal here at Cambridge, together with colleagues, on teachers and teaching, together with my colleagues Manaza Aslam and Shanila Rao. And we're currently doing one on alternative approaches to education, all working together with our wonderful implementing partners. I can see many of you are here, how, you know, really important you'll be, not just as sort of providing us with data, but actually the implementation being the first point. And then what are the questions we're asking, rather than us as researchers saying, OK, what questions do we want to ask? Now let's go out and find who we can work with on that. I think that's the wrong way round. The right way round is to start with the implementation. And I think what we've been trying to do is bring in sort of more innovation in the methods. So with the disability study, that's included photo voice, with the alternative approaches to education, looking at Rivers of Life, which is looking at girls' journeys over their lives. And Kate Jerry at the University of East Anglia has been great in giving us sort of advice and approaches to do that. And this has then helped us to get really the sort of voices of the girls and understanding of what's happening from the girls' perspective, from the teacher's perspective, from the children with disabilities perspective, and so on. So the study on teachers and teaching, the policy brief is available online, and along with a fuller report on the GEC website, has really sort of highlighted the increased and diverse roles of teachers during the pandemic, and how the different implementing partners that we focused on supported teachers during that time, and particularly female teachers for whom the burden fell on them in particular, alongside the other roles. Finally, I think the other example I just wanted to give was work that we're doing with CAMFED based on their GEC programme in Tanzania. And this isn't related to the independent evaluation, but other work. And again, this is why GEC has been so important. There's so many spin-offs that aren't just part of the formal part of the GEC, but so many other spin-offs. And we've been looking at the process of scaling up. So often people will question, OK, well, these projects are happening, you know, on a small scale. What's going to happen? Are they going to continue? And we've been working with CAMFED to understand the perspectives of government as to how and whether they would be able and willing to take on the CAMFED programme that, you know, there's already strong evidence from both the independent evaluation as well as from the external evaluators on the success in terms of impact on learning. But are they, and how are they able to take that on from the government perspective? And finally, also with CAMFED, I think another example where I think it's sort of really important to sort of think, for us to think further about, is what's the longer term impacts on changing aspects of gender equality, really shifting gender social norms. We know that they've improved learning in schools, but what's happening within the communities where now they've had quite a sustained, 10-year, if not more, sort of engagement. And I think that's again why GEC is so important, for sort of providing that environment for understanding and looking at these quite critical questions. So yeah, I think for me, going back to your question, Sharon, I think this is part and parcel of what any research should be about, if in education, from my point of view. Not to say that other research isn't valuable, but I think it's just been really great to see what's been achieved. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Pauline. And really respect and appreciate, what you were kind of saying initially. It's wonderful too that, you're locating your work within implementation evidence, and how much that really shapes what you're doing, and how they are complementary as far as, providing both those external researchers and internal sort of project implementers working together is really important, and the findings are much more relevant and rich and thoughtful as a result. So thank you for that. I'd like to now invite Judith Herbertson from FCDO to provide your reflections. Judith, I'm sure you work at all very different levels, certainly at the policy level, and would really value your thoughts on how implementation evidence is relevant or important to your work as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Sharon. It's really an enormous pleasure to be here with you all, and happy International Education Day. And thank you, first of all, to all of you who've been involved in the Girls Education Challenge programme over the last more than decade, and in particular to Sharon, you for your thought leadership. Evidence is, of course, vital to our work as part of government within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and we need to learn everything we can from programmes like the GEC that are so rich, so varied, so multifaceted, and that provide very, very deep learning for us. You're probably aware, and as I say, the Minister meant every word he was saying there, girls' education remains a top development priority for the UK. That's not just a comms line, we do mean it. Getting girls into school, keeping them there, safe, for 12 years of quality education, wherever possible. Tackling the barriers that might stop that happening, particularly for the most marginalised, those with disabilities, and then ensuring that they're able to learn, hence our focus on foundational learning as a way of opening up doors. But in a volatile world with so many crises that we all know about at the moment, in the wake of the pandemic, given the economic context, we have to ensure that what we do and what we fund is based on the best possible evidence and can deliver the best possible impact for the money that we have available to invest. It's not easy. And although many interventions aiming to improve quality, inclusion and equity in education have been tested around the world, it's not always clear from the existing research base why they work, for whom they work, and what the defining contextual circumstances are under which they work, or indeed why they don't work. And that is why implementation evidence is so important, because it enables us to learn from each other and to really understand both successes and failures. You never develop a vaccine with one shot. You have to fail several times over until you reach that goal, that pot of gold. And to some extent, it's the same in girls' education, or education more broadly. So not just what the outcome was, but also the how and the why an intervention worked or not. And we have a wealth of academic research on which we've based interventions, designed them carefully, but not all have then withstood first contact with the enemy, so to speak. So we cannot underestimate the importance of implementation evidence that looks at why these programmes don't work, and then how to adapt plans as we go along, as Nawal was describing in Somalia. And that really is the beauty of the GEC, because it can build for this evidence on a very, very broad base from across the 41 projects, across 17 very different countries. And this helps us to look at what works in Somalia, but won't work in Nepal, or where there are commonalities that can be taken into any context with more marginal tweaks. So political economy analysis, contextual analysis, trying, adapting, failing, adapting, all very important. And the learning briefs are going to add enormous value for us in terms of future programming and what works, where and for whom and why. And increasingly, we are asked from FCDO out at High Commissions, embassies, overseas network for evidence, expertise and advice on how partner governments can reform their education delivery systems to provide long-term sustainable impact. They sometimes want money, but increasingly many of them simply want the expertise, the knowledge, the know-how. And we can't do this on the basis of one thing that worked in one context. So it's critical for us to build a robust evidence base which enables a better understanding of what it takes to implement what works at scale, so that ministries of education can take on greater ownership while working sometimes with international support, be that financial or expertise, to build systems that will work for the future over the long term, help us all meet SDG 4, but really put them in the driving seat, which is where they are and where they should be. So thank you again to all involved, those on the ground, those pulling together the analysis, and thank you in advance for what remains to be done over the next 2 years as we wind down the remaining projects within the GEC and draw out all the learning that we can. As Pauline says, this is a rare beast. It's a flagship programme, as we like to say, but it is a long, deep and wide programme that has delivered an enormous amount for us. We also have a next generation programme that will build on and take forward what we've learnt and aim to take this to scale across a range of different countries. Thank you, Sharon. Back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Judith. Thank you very much for that. And it's really heartening to hear your reflections too on just how all of those evidence pieces fit together to form a really effective and helpful whole, particularly, as you noted, with regard to partner governments and how they can also be improving their results for girls and need a better understanding of what is working, but why and how. And I know that our next panelist, Sally, certainly has doing a lot of work with those partner governments through the GPE. So Sally, I would invite you to provide us with your thoughts and reflections as well on how implementation evidence is perhaps important to your work.
Great, thanks so much, Sharon, and to say I'm so delighted to be part of my reassociation with the GEC. I was a little bit involved at the beginning, and it's just great to come back a decade later and to see this huge body of evidence. And I recall that actually learning and evidence was a linchpin of the original concept of the GEC, and that's followed through. So it's just a delight to be here. I just thought it would be helpful to kick off a little bit, just for those who may not be so familiar with the Global Partnership of Education and how it works. I mean, GPE is the largest global fund solely dedicated to education in low-income countries, but it's also a partnership which brings additional technical and political assets to supporting education reform in partner countries. And in 2020, GPE created its new 5-year strategy. And within that, there was a strong and renewed but stronger commitment to gender equality through everything that GPE does. And this means working proactively and purposefully to support alongside countries to tackle the persuasive barriers for both girls and boys that are different in order to make sure that they can reach their full potential. So in terms of gaining access to GPE resources, it's a non-negotiable that gender equality within and through education is part of what a country proposes to do with GPE assets. But how and what they focus on within country is very much country-based and driven by context. So in practice, this type of evidence and these learning briefs is hugely timely for the GPE partnership, with this enhanced commitment to gender equality and also this different approach. So providing an example for those just based a little bit on the paper, if a particular country, through the analysis of the challenges and barriers that's now very much required as part of the GPE model, recognizes that the huge prevalence of gender-based violence within and around schools, the priority reform supported by GPE would have to demonstrate how country partners are developing approaches to address this challenge. And this is where implementation evidence is so important, because it'll really support that theory of change between the choice of the priority reform and how that leads to impact. So just a very small example I picked up from your rich paper was this assumption that if a referral pathway existed and rightly went through community organisation, that this would be functional. And this could very easily be done. But obviously what you've shown is that further interventions need to be made to support that, and that has to be continued. I mean, that's a tiny example. There's lots of rich material in the brief. So for those who haven't read it, I recommend you do. So certainly the GP, this was hugely timely. We've had discussions offline, and you kindly consulted in terms of the certain areas of focus that we could do learning briefs from, and that's based on some of the learning that we've heard from country partners. So delighted to do that. And then just finally, in picking up a little bit from what Pauline mentioned, I think there's also something about the approach to MEL that actually, as you know, part of GPE is very much they've got a MEL system, but actually thinking about it more with this implementation sort of lens is something I think we can also maybe take away in development. That's slightly outside of my job remit, but I think it's good to I think it's good to think about that more broadly. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's absolute pleasure, and looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Sally. Thank you so much for that. And yeah, you could almost say that in developing this learning brief series, we really had GP in mind as well, because that's hopefully, you know, what these briefs are relevant for and can help with. And thank you as well for sort of highlighting that one example that came from the SRGBV learning brief. I think when you were talking about that, it just reminds me what we're really highlighting are some of the assumptions that are made that only implementation evidence really kind of starts to challenge. The fact that a structure might be there doesn't mean the structure is functional or working. And you will only really know that if you're implementing on the ground and see that that structure isn't necessarily working. So that's, thank you for highlighting that. What I would love to do is, I know that there have been a lot of questions coming into the chat, and I'm sure a lot of rich discussion coming from our audience as well. And what I might do is hand over to Emma to kind of highlight some of the questions that we might have for the panel, and perhaps I'll circle back to our panel with a last question about perhaps collaboration and next steps with regard to evidence generation and complementarity. So Emma, do you want to help us out with the Q&A, please?
Yes. Hello, everybody. There are a couple of questions that are sort of being generated in the chat. One question, and I think this might be good for Nawal, is around how the implementation evidence is used by local actors within the system. And also how perhaps some of that collection of that implementation evidence actually feeds back into the participants and the girls' voices that actually generate some of it. That's one question. And then perhaps I'll pick one more, and maybe this is about the future. So I've lost it in the chat. Here we are. It's around this question around the learning briefs being focused on lessons learned from the evidence collected. But is there anything coming out around the detail of the approach and the components and the tools perhaps used to generate this implementation evidence? There are two questions there. I'll stop there and come back if we have time for more.
Yes, thank you. So in Somalia, as you know, which is a conflict-affected context, ministries of education struggle with very limited resources for, basic services, let alone tracking results and generating evidence. So while working with the regional, district, state level and national level education officials, we generate public learning products and disseminate evidence so that we have better uptake, local ownership, and broader reach. We have contributed to the education sector groups, the clusters, which serve as platforms for joint planning of assessments and dissemination of results. In case of our projects, generating implementation evidence on intersectionality provided a critical contribution to the sector planning. The evidence that we gathered actually was through our projects and in collaboration with the regional and district officials. was used in the Puntland State of Somalia Education Sector Analysis, the ESSC, and informed the state's education sector strategic plan. So our project uses, in similar manner, our project used implementation evidence in education for girls with disability and support the development of a public-private partnership between the Ministry of Education and private hospital networks. So enhancing more evidence on disability and the healthcare support for children with disability in rural areas and addressing conditions that hinder regular attendance. So I think that's what we have done. Thank you.
Thanks, Noel. And Emma, if that's okay, I might pick up on the second question with regard to details of approaches and tools that were used. So all of the briefs will have links to the projects that are being highlighted. And with regard to the particular approaches and tools, that's actually something that we're kind of working on as well with regard to a broad GEC library of resources. That is one of the hopeful legacies of the GEC program, is that it almost like a library, you can have, or we want to collate and collect and then structure a library for anyone that wants to do teacher training on reducing corporal punishment, or wants to start to design and implement a girls' club and that sort of thing. And again, we're trying to really leverage our comparative advantage of having 41 projects across 17 countries. I mean, the number of approaches and tools and training manuals and whatnot that have been produced is mind-boggling, and certainly something that should be used and could be used as a global public good, particularly, if anything, to prevent duplication, reinventing the wheel. We've seen it happen. It happens all the time, and really it shouldn't. So that is something that we're working on, and we've been talking to the GEC projects about that. So sort of watch this space with regard to that library of resource that will be coming as well. Emma, were there any other questions that you wanted to pick up on?
There was one more in the chat, actually. I thought might be open up for the rest of the panel. From Anna Strain, how does this work with results-based funding? Is it that we are generating learning, including what's working and not working, rather than achievements? Do you see a shift towards this sort of approach in other sectors, perhaps over a longer period? That's quite a big question. It's Judith looking like she would like to answer.
I'm happy to have a shot at it. I was smiling wryly. I think it's a really good challenge because we have been shifting to outcome funds. We see development bonds, development impact funding, and that is where we are trying to tie partners in to delivering on what we've asked them to deliver to a certain standard for a specific sum of money, the budget, and we reward that delivery, if you like. Now, the problem is if we have got the design wrong at the beginning, and actually either it's not deliverable or we should be able to deliver it in a very different way, that is only successful if the implementing partner is able to build the evidence, do that adaptive learning as they go along, and change the way in which they're delivering in order to deliver to time the success that we've asked them for. And we need to be very, very clear that that theory of change, that is the results, those are the results rather, or that is the impact that we want to have delivered, really does remain the focus for the length of the programme, and enduring perhaps crises or exogenous shocks, and that's still what we want delivered. So it relies on a very collaborative partnership between the funder and the implementing partner, and not an implementing partner that just puts their head down and pedals and pedals and pedals and says, look, we've done it now, give us the money. Otherwise, you might get the best out of the arrangement or you might not. That said, too often, as you'll have seen, if you look at the reviews that we publish on the external website, we often meet the outputs of our programmes. We are less good at meeting the outcomes, and we rarely circle back and say, that really did deliver the impact that we were requiring it to do. And so it's a complex question with a bit of a messy answer from me, but I think it's something we need to explore more. So thank you.
Sharon, could I just come in as well? Is that okay? I think Sally can probably speak to this better than me as well, but I think it is quite interesting as well, the sort of trajectory of the Girls' Education Challenge, that in the first phase there was quite a strong results-based financing approach, which had, I mean, I think probably fair to say its challenges, and that's why for the phase 2 that changed, rather than from stick to more carrot, more sort of incentive approaches. And again, I think there's a lot of learning from these sort of governance aspects of the GEC. And it's something that I know both with the fund manager and independent evaluators, we've been discussing together about actually capturing some of this learning as the sort of this second phase of the GEC is sort of coming towards an end. And I think that's going to be, in my view, really valuable, because there's a lot of really important institutional memory that people have got of how a programme of this scope, like you were saying, do this flagship program that sort of, you know, obviously with challenges along the way that we all know. And Noelle, I'm sure you've been seeing it from the sort of projects that you're familiar with. We've got a lot of implementing partners here who would also be very familiar with where there have been challenges of the sort of structures. And I think that's going to be really helpful to capture as well. So and just pick up on, I saw Rachel Hinton made a related point on costs. And I think that's also something, again, that the GEC has provided really valuable information. Again, we did a study with CAMFED on cost effectiveness of its programme. Valsa has been doing a lot of work with Fund Manager on the cost effectiveness. And I think this is quite unique to have this type of information and data. So I think it's great to see what's happening at the forefront, and girls' education being at the forefront of evidence on education more generally.
Thanks, Pauline. And just to kind of build on that as well, you know, that historical, you know, view of how the GEC has changed. Certainly COVID was another factor and had an impact on our design and implementation of activities. And that is actually, again, where, you know, at least in my reflection, you know, implementation evidence really started to come to the fore. You know, where everyone was just thinking on their feet and looking at what was happening, what was working, what can we do immediately, and shift the dial on that. So that was also a shock, but with a positive outcome as well. Conscious of time, Emma, was there anything else you wanted to touch on, or shall I?
I think we probably need to wrap up, but just to say in the chat, Valsa Shah, the Value for Money lead on the FM, is really willing to share anything we have on value for money, and there's some excellent reports that she's produced. So please do get in touch with Valsa. I'll pop her email in the chat, because I know we probably have about 5 minutes left. Over to you, Sharon.
Great. Well, so my last question, I'm not sure if I'm kind of I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, in that, you know, it's more about because we've had such a rich discussion, and clearly there's a lot of appreciation and collaboration that's already happening, at least in our discussion here. But what I would love, and to get reflections from each of our panelists on, is that we all kind of represent very different kind of stakeholder areas within this girls' education ecosystem. And clearly we all see the value of implementation evidence that the GEC learning briefs are going to be bringing to the fore. And I would just love your very brief reflections on how you think we can be collaborating better, you know, as donors, as academic researchers, as implementers on the ground, as funders. You know, how can we be collaborating better to make sure that everyone is using this evidence, is seeing this evidence, is you know, actually actioning the complementary nature of that evidence. So I'll start with Noelle again. Any reflections on your part, Noelle?
Yes, I think a good example of how collaborating it is in regards to complementing the implementation evidence is the academic evidence that was done, the ex-post study evidence study that was conducted by University of Portsmouth through the Rapid Research and Learning Fund. The results were incredible and showed the extent to which, an integrated program combining an education component with girls' leadership skills development, social norm changes at school and community levels, and economic empowerment can have a transformative impact in a conflict-affected context. So in academic-wise, I think having collaboration and making sure that we follow up on our implementation shows how the impact that interventions has on target girls and in having much better life outcomes than their peers. So from an implementer standpoint, this really made me feel good, and especially at the end of the day, that's the impact change that we need to see in our girls.
Thank you for that. And just in case people aren't familiar with that piece that Nawal was talking about, the University of Portsmouth was able to come in after the project was closed. Is that correct, Nawal? And kind of look at the effects of the project after the fact. And that is a really lovely example of how, the implementation evidence that you were using to make sure that project was effective as you were implementing it was then validated and amplified after the fact by the researchers at Portsmouth. So that's a really lovely example of how we can collaborate better and hopefully when that's being disseminated, amplify the great work that you were doing, at the forefront when you were implementing. Pauline, any reflections on your behalf?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think we should just all collectively be proud of what we've achieved. I think, we should celebrate it. There's a lot that we've done in girls' education that, as I was just saying, is at the forefront of how we should be doing things, and we can always be critical, we can do things better, etc. The one thing I would say, and it links with a comment in the chat, is about how to really make sure that the dissemination, feedback and learning happens not just at the more global level, but within countries and within communities, not just with the implementing partners, but also with the communities and teachers, etc. Because I think, that's where the buck ultimately stops, and it's challenging, it's can be resource intense, etc. But I think it's absolutely vital, and just thinking more about how we can best do that, and who is best placed to do it and so on would be really valuable as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yes, thank you for highlighting that, and thank you for the person who highlighted it in the chat in the first instance. Judith, I invite you to give any reflections on your part.
Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating discussion. I think it's a real conundrum, isn't it? Why have we not got a really good answer for how we generate evidence, share it, and make all of our collected work more successful? We know that educating girls is one of the most cost-effective and impactful investments we can make, and it affects all sorts of development indicators, not just the education piece, with intergenerational benefits. And yet, despite the progress, the poorest and most marginalised girls and the children with disabilities are being left further behind. Why is it? Why don't we know how to overcome it? Within the FCDO, we tend to use different forms of evidence at different times and for different reasons. So we use quantitative, qualitative research for policies, new programs, and then the implementation evidence helps our advisors to translate policies and evidence into the context where they're working, and then to use that research and adapt and flex and be agile, as we say, to ensure that the program evolves or the intervention evolves as we move forward. We also often find that case studies and really relevant to on the ground contexts are most useful when working with our partner governments to understand and champion others to produce more academic evidence that they can then feed into their system. But I'm very aware that many of us are producing our own learning, our own versions of evidence and policies, including on climate change. And the more we can share and collaborate, the better. We shouldn't be doing this in silos. It should be building up, which I think is why the GEC has done such a fantastic job. We've got generations of children waiting for us, and the more streamlined, the more effective we can be, the better. We will be we are developing what we're calling a centre of expertise, which will be a kind of one-stop shop on girls' education within FCDO. We will come out to you with more information on this, but it is about learning, evidence, research, implementation lessons, and we hope we will be able to contribute more in the future. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious of time. Sally, would you like to?
I'll be very, very quick. I think people have just 3 quick things from me, and I had written it down before, so I'm not copying you full in. I think we do coordinate quite a lot at international level, actually, and some would argue too much. And I think what we should do is, I'm just joking. I think what we should do is have evidence production and dissemination much closer to the level it's going to be used and acted upon. And our responsibility is to create systems to make that happen. So that's number one. I think number two is using existing platforms, and there's just a little bit of a plug for GPE KICS regional hub. So they exist in regions, they're there. I know that GEC has been cooperating with them. So again, not sort of setting up sort of separate functions. No, I think it's just, that'll do. 2 things. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. Sort of spot on with regard to systems for dissemination. And when you're talking about the KICS platforms, that's not a plug, it's communication. And that was something that we need to do much better amongst ourselves, is communicate and let everyone know what we're all working on and try to align as opposed to overlap and duplicate. So anyway, on that note, I really, I've really enjoyed this discussion, and I really want to thank our panelists for their very thoughtful contributions, as well as to our participants who've prompted some really interesting questions and reflections as well in the chat. So thank you very much for joining, and we will be communicating, hopefully far and wide, about the GC Learning Brief series, pushing them out as they are finished, and really look forward to your feedback on those as well. So thanks very much, everyone, and happy International Day of Education. Thanks.
Thanks, Sharon.